Number 1. Omaima Nelson. It was Thanksgiving weekend in 1991 when police in Costa Mesa, California, stumbled onto a crime so shocking that even seasoned investigators were left reeling. At the center of it all was Omaima Nelson, a 23-year-old Egyptian-born former model and nanny who had moved to the United States only a few years earlier. Outwardly, she seemed to be living the American dream. Friends described her as strikingly beautiful, charming, and eager to build a new life in California. But behind that facade was a marriage unraveling and a hidden darkness that would erupt in one of the most infamous crimes in Orange County history. Omaima had married William Bill Nelson, a 56-year-old pilot and real estate investor, after knowing him for less than 2 months. The two seemed an odd pair. Bill was twice her age and already divorced, while Omaima was young, glamorous, and searching for stability. Yet the relationship moved quickly, fueled by whirlwind romance and promises of comfort. But those who knew them said the union was volatile. Arguments were frequent, and the couple's friends noted a growing tension that seemed destined to boil over. That breaking point came on Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 1991. At some point during the holiday, Omaima killed her husband inside their Costa Mesa apartment. The act itself was brutal, but what came afterward horrified even more. Prosecutors later revealed that she dismembered his body, cut it into pieces, and, in an even more disturbing twist, cooked and consumed parts of him. She later claimed she was in a psychotic state, saying she had been abused and snapped in self-defense. But investigators weren't convinced. To them, this was not only a killing, but a deliberate attempt to cover up evidence in ways that defied comprehension. The discovery began when Omaima showed up at a friend's house with garbage bags filled with human remains, attempting to enlist help in disposing of them. Alarmed, the friend contacted police, who soon entered the Nelson apartment. What they found was a nightmare scene. Bill's remains scattered, evidence of cooking, and a story that would instantly grab headlines nationwide. Detectives compared the case to horror films. Prosecutors even invoked the name of Hannibal Lecter when describing what she had done, underscoring the shock value that made the trial front-page news. The legal process began in 1992, and the defense tried to paint a picture of a battered woman pushed to her breaking point. Omaima's attorneys argued she had endured abuse at Bill's hands, and that her actions, though extreme, came in a moment of trauma and confusion. But the prosecution countered with evidence showing planning and calculation. They emphasized not only the act of killing, but the gruesome disposal of the body, which prosecutors argued could not be explained by self-defense alone. In January 1993, a California jury convicted Omaima Nelson of second-degree murder and sentenced her to 27 years to life in prison. The verdict rejected her self-defense claim, but stopped short of first-degree murder. Omaima later appeared before parole boards, but each request was denied. In 2006 and 2011, officials cited the brutality of her actions and her lack of remorse. Reports described her as detached and unbothered by the seriousness of her crime. She remains incarcerated in California with little chance of release. Public reaction mixed revulsion with fascination. Media focused on the grotesque details, making Omaima a symbol of one of California's most disturbing domestic homicides. Documentaries and books continue to revisit her story, often highlighting the stark contrast between her outward glamour and the horrific crime. Her case endures because of what it represents: beauty colliding with violence and betrayal. A woman once seen as full of promise became forever linked to one of Orange County's darkest chapters. Each time her name resurfaces, the chilling details follow. Number 2 takes us from California to Las Vegas, where another model's entanglement with a wealthy benefactor ended in tragedy. Number 2. Kelsey Turner. When news broke in March 2019 that the body of a well-known California psychiatrist had been discovered in the trunk of an abandoned car outside Las Vegas, The story was bizarre enough to make national headlines. But when investigators revealed that the car belonged to a 25-year-old model named Kelsey Turner, the case exploded into one of the most sensational murder trials Nevada had seen in years. Turner was not unknown to the public. She had modeled for men's magazines like Maxim and Playboy, and cultivated a glamorous presence on Instagram, where she posed in bikinis and designer clothes, projecting the life of a rising influencer. Behind the filtered photos, however, she was struggling. Friends and acquaintances later described her lifestyle as expensive and unstable, one funded in part by the financial generosity of Dr. Thomas Burchard, a 71-year-old child psychiatrist from California. Burchard had been supporting Turner for several years, paying for her rent and expenses, and in return maintaining what some described as a sugar daddy arrangement. To outsiders, it seemed unusual, but by all accounts, Burchard was trying to help her financially. That arrangement soured in early 2019. Burchard reportedly told Turner he was planning to stop giving her money. For Turner, who had grown reliant on his support, this was a turning point. According to prosecutors, what began as a financial dispute spiraled into something much darker. On March 7, 2019, Burchard traveled to Las Vegas to meet Turner and discuss the matter. It would be the last trip he ever made. 2 weeks later, police in Nevada were called to investigate an abandoned vehicle. Inside the trunk, they made a grim discovery. Burchard's body, covered in severe head injuries caused by repeated blows from a baseball bat. The car was registered to Kelsey Turner. That connection set off a manhunt that quickly brought Turner and her then-boyfriend, John Kennison, into custody. Investigators pieced together what they believed had happened. They argued that Kennison carried out the actual beating, but that Turner played a central role in luring Burchard to the house and orchestrating the attack. The motive, according to the prosecution, was money. Turner, they said, feared losing the financial lifeline that Burchard had provided. In the days after the killing, Turner reportedly tried to distance herself, but the evidence, from witness accounts to the abandoned car, pointed directly to her involvement. The case drew wide attention, not only for its brutality, but for who was involved: a respected psychiatrist and a young model with a polished social media presence. National outlets quickly labeled it the Playboy model murder. ABC's 2020 even aired a full episode titled A Model Murder, highlighting the contradictions of the case. In January 2023, nearly 4 years the murder, Kelsey Turner appeared in a Nevada courtroom. Facing the possibility of a first-degree conviction, she entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder, not admitting guilt, but accepting that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 10. For the family and friends of Dr. Burchard, the ruling brought some closure, but not relief. Colleagues remembered him as a compassionate doctor dedicated to helping children, making his violent death at the hands of people he once supported especially painful. Public reaction was split. Some focused on Turner's past image of beauty and luxury, while others viewed the case as an example of exploitation in financial relationships between older benefactors and younger companions. Either way, the details kept the story alive long after sentencing. Today, Turner is serving her sentence in Nevada. Her Instagram remains frozen, filled with images of a glamorous life that ended in tragedy. For many, her downfall shows how social media's polished image can conceal darker realities. Number 3 takes us from Las Vegas to the cosplay community in Florida, where another model's carefully curated image collapsed under the weight of a violent crime. Number 3. Melissa Turner. In the world of cosplay, Melissa Turner was known as someone who brought fantasy characters to life. She attended conventions, created online content, and built a modest following in the anime and cosplay community. Her social media pages were filled with photos of costumes and colorful personas, a curated image of someone living a playful, creative life. But in October 2019, that image would shatter completely when her private life turned deadly. Melissa lived in Florida with her boyfriend, 25-year-old Matthew Trussler. From the outside, they seemed like an ordinary couple trying to make their way. But behind closed doors, prosecutors later argued, the relationship was riddled with tension. The pivotal moment came in the early morning hours of October 18, 2019. Something ignited between them that night, and by the time it ended, Trussler was dead from stab wounds. When police arrived at the home, the scene raised immediate questions. Turner initially claimed she had acted in self-defense after enduring abuse. She told investigators that the violence of that night was the culmination of a toxic relationship in which she had feared for her life. But the physical evidence told a more complicated story. Prosecutors alleged that Turner had not acted in desperation, but instead had lashed out violently in an argument. What tipped the case further against her were contradictions in her statements and the nature of the wounds. Detectives pointed out inconsistencies in her timeline and argued that her claim of being cornered did not match the forensic findings. As investigators pieced together the night's events, they concluded that Turner had attacked Matthew in anger, not self-defense. The trial began in February 2022 and quickly drew local coverage. Headlines highlighted the contrast: a self-proclaimed cosplay princess now facing a murder charge. Reporters filled the Tampa courtroom as jurors heard both sides. The defense argued Melissa was a victim who broke under years of abuse. Prosecutors countered with a portrayal of a volatile woman unwilling to relinquish control. Jurors deliberated and ultimately rejected her self-defense claim. Melissa Turner was convicted of second-degree murder. For her family and supporters, the verdict was crushing. For Matthew's loved ones, it was a long-awaited confirmation of justice. Sentencing followed in March 2022. Turner, then 29, listened as the judge handed down 20.5 years in prison. Prosecutors had sought up to 35 years, but the final sentence still meant she would lose much of her adult life to incarceration. When Matthew's mother addressed the court, she condemned Turner's abuse narrative, saying it had deepened the family's pain as much as the crime itself. The public was struck by the contrast between Melissa's online persona and the reality behind it. She had built an image through costumes and conventions, yet beneath the characters was a woman responsible for a deadly act. News outlets and true crime shows amplified that divide, showing how curated personas can mask darker truths. Today, Melissa Turner serves her time in a Florida prison with release decades away at best. To many, her downfall illustrates how quickly a life can unravel, from cosplay stages and social media posts to a conviction that defines her future. It remains a sobering story, a reminder that appearances can deceive and that behind even the brightest images can be turmoil and tragedy. Number 4 takes us deeper into Florida, to a case compared to Black Swan, where a former dancer and model stood trial for the murder of her husband. Number 4. Ashley Benefield. The story of Ashley Benefield had all the makings of a tragic drama: beauty, ambition, romance, and ultimately, violence. She had once been known in Sarasota, Florida, as a graceful ballet dancer and occasional bikini model. She founded a small dance troupe and carried herself in social circles as someone elegant, admired, and on the rise. But by 2020, Ashley's name would no longer be linked to art or glamour. Instead, she became the central figure in what the media quickly dubbed the Black Swan case, a crime that would end with her facing a lengthy prison sentence. Ashley met Doug Benefield, a 58-year-old widower, in 2016. Their relationship developed quickly, leading to a marriage that drew whispers because of the age gap and the speed with which they committed to one another. At first, Doug appeared smitten. He was successful, well-connected, and willing to support Ashley's dreams. But as time passed, the marriage soured. Friends and acquaintances described mounting friction between them, disputes about money, and tension surrounding their young daughter. By 2020, the relationship had become defined more by hostility than affection. On September 27, 2020, the conflict reached its breaking point. Ashley shot Doug inside their Florida home. When police arrived, she claimed she had acted in self-defense. According to her account, Doug had been abusive, and she feared for her life in that moment. But investigators noted something that raised immediate doubts. There were no visible injuries on Ashley, no signs to corroborate her claims. Detectives suspected her version of events was less about survival and more about eliminating her husband during a contentious custody dispute. The prosecution leaned heavily on those inconsistencies. They argued that Ashley had created a false narrative to shield herself from responsibility, portraying herself as a victim when in fact she was the aggressor. The defense tried to push back, insisting that Doug's history and their volatile arguments created a genuine fear for Ashley's safety. But the jury, after hearing both sides, was unconvinced by her self-defense story. In 2024, Ashley was convicted not of second-degree murder, as originally charged, but of manslaughter, a lesser count, but one that still carried severe consequences. In December of that year, she stood before the court for sentencing. The judge handed her 20 years in prison, with credit for time already spent in custody. It was a ruling that balanced the jury's finding of culpability with the fact that prosecutors had not secured a full murder conviction. At sentencing, Ashley's demeanor stood out. Reporters noted she appeared stone-faced, showing little emotion as her fate was decided. That detachment contrasted sharply with the grief in the courtroom. Doug's daughter called Ashley an evil woman who had betrayed her father, a statement that echoed the feelings of many who followed the trial. The case drew national coverage, with comparisons to Black Swan and its themes of beauty hiding inner turmoil. 48 Hours devoted a feature to the question of whether Ashley was a victim of abuse or a manipulative figure using it as a shield. For many, her story reflected the unsettling idea that grace and charm can mask cold calculation. Now in her early 30s, Ashley Benefield faces decades in prison. The contrast between her past as a ballerina and her present in a cell has fueled public fascination. To some, her story is a warning about relationships built on secrecy and imbalance. To others, it shows how quickly perception can change, from elegant performer to convicted felon within a few years. The Black Swan label stuck because the case carried the same eerie blend of beauty and menace. Her trial highlighted the difficulty courts face when self-defense claims leave only one side to speak. In the end, the jury's decision ensured Ashley would remain behind bars, even as debate over her true motives continues. Number 5 takes us to Hollywood, where another model-turned-actress became infamous for orchestrating a violent plot that shocked the entertainment industry. Number 5, Claudia Haro. In Hollywood during the 1980s and 90s, Claudia Haro was known for her striking looks and high-profile connections. A former fashion model who transitioned into acting, she appeared in films like Casino and became part of the glamorous circles of Los Angeles. She was once married to legendary actor Joe Pesci, a link that made her name recognizable even beyond her modeling work. To the outside world, she seemed to have carved out a comfortable place in the entertainment industry. But behind the sparkle of red carpets and movie roles, Haro's personal life was turbulent. And in 2000, that turbulence spiraled into violence that would stain her reputation forever. At the center of the storm was her second husband, Garrett Warren, a Hollywood stuntman. Warren had worked on major productions and was respected in the film community for his daring work. But his marriage to Claudia Haro was short-lived and ended in bitter disputes, particularly over custody of their daughter. According to prosecutors, those battles consumed Haro to the point where she made a devastating decision to eliminate her former partner altogether. On the evening of May 20th, 2000, Warren answered a knock at the door of his Westlake Village home. When he opened it, he was met with a barrage of bullets. He was shot 4 times in front of his mother, who witnessed the horrifying attack. Against the odds, Warren survived, but the injuries were catastrophic. He lost his right eye and endured multiple surgeries, leaving him permanently scarred. The question immediately arose: who would want him dead? For 2 years, the case remained unsolved. Detectives combed through Warren's personal and professional life, looking for enemies. It wasn't until 2002 that new evidence pointed in a shocking direction. Back to Claudia Haro herself. Investigators learned that Haro, fueled by rage over the custody dispute, had allegedly hired hitmen to carry out the attempted killing. Her own brother, Manuel Haro, was implicated in helping arrange the plan. The revelation stunned Hollywood. Claudia, once a familiar face on film sets and society pages, was now accused of plotting the death of her child's father. Tabloids quickly branded her Joe Pesci's criminal ex-wife, and every development was splashed across headlines. To many, it was almost cinematic, a story blending glamour, betrayal, and violence. But for Garrett Warren, it was no movie. He bore the lifelong scars of the attack, and he had to raise his daughter knowing her mother was accused of orchestrating the attempt on his life. After years of legal wrangling, Claudia's case finally came to a close in 2012. Facing overwhelming evidence, she pleaded no contest to 2 counts of attempted murder. The court handed down a sentence of 12 years and 4 months in prison, while her brother received a life term for his role in the scheme. Claudia was incarcerated in a California facility, a dramatic fall from grace for a woman who had once walked red carpets alongside Hollywood elites. During her time behind bars, her story continued to fascinate the public. Documentaries and true crime specials dissected the case, exploring how a woman who once had access to wealth and celebrity circles could resort to such a drastic and destructive plan. The contrast between Claudia's glamorous film appearances and her mugshot in Prison Blues made the case all the more compelling for viewers. In August 2019, after serving 7 years, Claudia Haro was released on parole. Her release reignited public interest, with headlines once again revisiting her past. For some, she was a tragic figure, undone by anger and poor decisions. For others, she was a cautionary tale about how personal grudges can drive people to unthinkable extremes. Claudia's story continues to circulate in Hollywood lore. It is often retold not just because of the crime itself, but because of who she was. A model and actress who appeared to have it all, only to see it collapse in spectacular fashion. Her name remains forever linked to the attempted assassination of Garrett Warren, a man who survived against the odds and whose resilience became part of the public narrative. From fashion shoots and movie sets to prison walls, Claudia Haro's journey stands as one of Hollywood's most notorious scandals. It blurred the line between celebrity and crime, leaving behind a story that is as unsettling as it is unforgettable. Number 6 shifts from Hollywood circles to New York's social scene, where a self-styled heiress fooled Manhattan's elite before landing behind bars. Number 6. Anna Sorokin, also known as Anna Delvey. In the mid-2000s, New York's high society was captivated by a mysterious young woman who seemed to have stepped straight out of the pages of a glossy magazine. She dressed in couture, stayed in luxury hotels, and spoke with the confidence of old money. Her name was Anna Delvey, or so everyone thought. In truth, her real name was Anna Sorokin, a Russian immigrant who had reinvented herself as a wealthy German heiress. For a while, the illusion worked. She moved through the city's exclusive circles with ease, dining with the elite and living a lifestyle that most only dream of. But behind the polished image was a carefully constructed fraud that would unravel in spectacular fashion. Between 2016 and 2017, Sorokin orchestrated a series of cons that allowed her to sustain her extravagant life. She skipped out on hotel bills, presented falsified bank documents to secure loans, and even persuaded friends to cover expenses for lavish trips. One of the most infamous examples was a luxury getaway to Marrakesh that left a close friend footing a bill of more than $60,000. To those around her, she seemed like a charismatic socialite with endless resources. But in reality, the money wasn't hers. It was borrowed, stolen, or simply unpaid. The tipping point came when her unpaid debts and bold fabrications collided. Hotels that once welcomed her closed their doors. Investors who considered funding her proposed arts club began asking harder questions. By 2018, the facade had cracked wide open. Investigators uncovered the paper trail of fraud, and Anna Sorokin found herself under arrest, accused of swindling more than $200,000. Her trial in New York in 2019 became a media spectacle. The prosecution described her as a con artist who exploited the city's appetite for glamour, using deception to gain access to people and places she had no business entering. The defense countered that she was, simply trying to fake it until she made it, portraying her as an ambitious young woman chasing the American dream in unconventional ways. Jurors didn't buy that explanation. In April 2019, Sorokin, then 28 years old, was convicted on multiple counts of grand larceny and theft of services. The judge, exasperated by the extent of her schemes, remarked on the depth of her deception and handed down a sentence of 4 to 12 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution and fines, totaling nearly $200,000. The punishment marked the end of her reign as New York's most notorious heiress. Anna served just under 4 years behind bars, benefiting from good behavior credits. In February 2021, she walked out of prison, only to be immediately taken into custody by federal immigration officials for overstaying her visa. Even as she awaited deportation proceedings, her name remained a topic of fascination, a blend of notoriety and celebrity. Public reaction to her story was unlike most white-collar crime cases. A viral New York Magazine profile captured the imagination of readers, turning her into a cultural talking point. Netflix soon adapted the story into the hit series Inventing Anna, with millions tuning in to watch her cons dramatized for television. Social media buzzed with debates about whether she was a villain, a folk anti-hero, or simply a reflection of society's obsession with wealth and status. For prosecutors, the case was simple. Anna Sorokin had defrauded banks, hotels, and friends, and justice required accountability. For much of the public, though, the fascination lay in how convincingly she managed to play the role of an heiress, and how easily people wanted to believe in her. In that sense, her crimes revealed as much about New York's culture of excess as they did about her own ambition. Today, Sorokin remains a polarizing figure. Some see her as a dangerous manipulator who left a trail of victims. Others view her as a symbol of audacious reinvention, someone who exploited the very system that idolizes wealth and exclusivity. Whatever the perspective, her story has cemented her place in the true crime landscape, not as a killer, but as one of the most infamous fraudsters of her generation. Number 7 moves us away from New York's high society and back to the world of fashion reality television, where a once promising contestant on America's Next Top Model saw her career collapse into a long prison sentence. Number 7, Renee Alway. In 2007, millions of viewers tuned in to watch America's Next Top Model, a reality show that promised to turn unknown faces into household names. Among the contestants was Renee Alway, a striking young woman from Michigan who carried herself with confidence and intensity. She made it to the final 3 of her season, and many thought she had the talent to go all the way. On screen, she was portrayed as tough and outspoken, sometimes clashing with other contestants, but always catching the camera's attention. For a brief moment, Renee looked destined for fame, modeling contracts, and a career in fashion. But what began as a rise to stardom quickly unraveled into a life plagued by addiction, crime, and eventually a lengthy prison sentence. After the show, Renee tried to parlay her newfound recognition into steady modeling work. Yet opportunities dried up, and she struggled with the harsh realities of life outside the controlled world of reality television. Financial problems mounted, and personal struggles followed. By the early 2000s, her name was no longer appearing in fashion headlines, but in police blotters. The turning point came in June 2013, when police in Palm Springs, California, responded to reports of a suspicious woman hiding in a vacant home. What they discovered was Renee Alway, crouched in a garage with a gun. The standoff that followed lasted 6 hours, ending with her surrender and arrest. The details were jarring. She was armed, trespassing, and allegedly carrying stolen property. Investigators soon tied her to a string of burglaries, thefts, and drug offenses in the area. Prosecutors painted a stark picture of her descent. Once a model gracing television screens, Renee had become ensnared in methamphetamine use and criminal activity. She was charged with multiple felonies, including burglary, identity theft, and firearm possession. The image of her mugshot, a far cry from her polished appearance on television, spread quickly across the internet, drawing both shock and sympathy from those who remembered her modeling days. In 2014, Renee accepted a plea deal. She admitted guilt to several counts, avoiding trial but ensuring a heavy sentence. The court handed her 12 years in prison, a staggering punishment that reflected the seriousness of her offenses and her repeated run-ins with the law. For many fans of America's Next Top Model, the news felt surreal. How could someone who once stood on the brink of stardom fall so far, so fast? Behind bars, Renee spoke candidly about her struggles. In interviews, she admitted to battling addiction and feeling lost after her time in the spotlight ended. She described how fleeting fame had left her unprepared for life without support, and how those pressures contributed to her spiral. Her words shed light on the darker side of reality television. The way contestants are thrust into fame and then left to fend for themselves once the cameras stop rolling. The public reaction to her imprisonment was mixed. Some expressed compassion, seeing her as a tragic figure who never found stability after her brief fame. Others pointed to the severity of her crimes, arguing that the punishment fit the choices she made. Media outlets covered her case extensively, often juxtaposing glamorous images from her modeling days with the harsh reality of her mugshot and prison term. By the late 2000s, Renee was serving her sentence in a California state prison, cut off from the life she once imagined. For her, the path from reality TV hopeful to convicted felon was a cautionary tale. She had been given an extraordinary platform, but instead of turning it into a sustainable career, her life became defined by addiction, crime, and incarceration. Yet even in prison, Renee's story continued to resonate. True crime programs revisited her downfall, while discussions online debated whether her trajectory was the result of personal weakness or a system that exploits and discards young talent. Either way, her case remains one of the most memorable in the intersection of fashion, television, and crime. Number 8 takes us to a figure from a much earlier era, a former Playboy playmate whose name once stood for glamour in the 1960s, only to later be tied to a violent act that landed her in prison. Number 8. Victoria Vetri, also known as Angela Dorian. In the late 1960s, Victoria Vetri was at the peak of glamour. Under the name Angela Dorian, she posed for Playboy and was crowned Playmate of the Year in 1968, a title that made her an instant symbol of beauty and sophistication. She appeared in films and television, brushing shoulders with Hollywood stars during an era when the magazine's centerfolds were cultural icons. For a time, it seemed she had secured her place in the spotlight, remembered for her classic looks and charm. But decades later, her name would resurface not for nostalgia, but for violence, when a crime in Hollywood made headlines worldwide. By 2010, Vetri was far removed from her days as a rising star. She was 66 years old, living quietly in Los Angeles with her husband, Bruce Rathgeb. The couple's relationship was strained, marked by arguments and suspicions. On a September evening that year, tensions escalated into an explosive moment. Convinced her husband was being unfaithful, Vetri grabbed a handgun. As Bruce tried to walk out of their apartment, she pulled the trigger, shooting him in the back. Remarkably, Bruce survived the shooting, though his injuries were serious. In the chaos that followed, Victoria attempted to distance herself from responsibility. At first, she claimed that a drug dealer had been the one to fire the gun, a story investigators quickly dismissed. The evidence pointed squarely back to her, and the former playmate who once graced magazine covers was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. The case moved swiftly through the California courts. Prosecutors charged her with attempted murder, a count that carried the potential for a life sentence if she were convicted. But in September 2011, Vetri struck a deal. She pleaded no contest to attempted voluntary manslaughter, a plea that acknowledged her guilt while sparing her the risk of the harsher penalty. The court sentenced her to 9 years in state prison, a dramatic fall for someone who had once been celebrated for beauty and allure. The contrast was not lost on the media. Headlines fixated on the irony. Ex-Playboy playmate gets prison for shooting her husband. Outlets like E! News ran the story side by side with archival photos from her modeling days, underscoring the stark shift from designer gowns to prison attire. For many readers, the case became a strange intersection of nostalgia and scandal. A woman who had once embodied the free-spirited glamour of the 1960s now facing the reality of a prison sentence. Public fascination with the case was heightened by the era she came from. The flower power decade had produced many cultural figures, but few stories turned as dark as this one. Commentators noted the tragic arc of her life, from being celebrated in glossy spreads and films to standing in a courtroom accused of violence. Her sentencing brought closure in a legal sense, but in the public imagination, it became a cautionary tale about how fame fades and personal demons can consume even those who once seemed untouchable. Victoria Vetri served several years in prison before eventually being released on parole in the late 2000s. By then, she had largely disappeared from public view, yet her case remains one of the most notorious examples of a celebrity downfall in Los Angeles, often cited in retrospectives about former playmates whose lives took dramatic turns. The stark contrast between her youthful glamour and the mugshot that circulated in 2010 continues to resonate, a reminder of how drastically fortunes can change. For those who remembered her as Angela Dorian, Playmate of the Year, the crime felt almost unreal. But for her husband, who lived with the physical scars of the shooting, and for the courts, it was all too real. The story endures not just as a sensational crime, but as a sobering example of how suspicion, anger, and violence can destroy lives, no matter how gilded the past once was. Number 9 takes us to Ohio, where another model made headlines for plotting an unthinkable crime, and was caught in the act of trying to hire a hitman. Number 9. Tara Lambert. In small-town Ohio, Tara Lambert was known as an attractive former fashion model who seemed to be living a stable suburban life. She had done some modeling in her youth and built the image of a woman with beauty and sophistication, raising children in what appeared to be a conventional family setting. But in January 2016, her polished image crumbled in the harshest possible way. That month, she was convicted of trying to orchestrate a murder-for-hire plot that sounded like something pulled from a crime thriller. The target was not a stranger, nor a business rival, but the mother of her husband's children, her stepchildren's biological mother. By removing her, Tara believed she could eliminate a source of tension in her family life. Prosecutors later revealed the chilling lengths she went to in pursuit of that idea. In 2015, she met with a man she believed was a hitman and detailed what she wanted him to do. According to court testimony, she even suggested the body be disposed of in a wood chipper. What Tara didn't know was that the supposed hitman was an undercover officer, and every word she spoke was being recorded. The meeting itself was almost mundane in its setting. Reports noted that she met the undercover officer in a Walmart parking lot, where she handed over a down payment for the killing. The casual backdrop, a shopping center in the middle of Ohio, made the story even more surreal. Here was a woman who once graced photographs as a model, now casually arranging for someone's murder in a parking lot, as though it were an errand on her to-do list. When authorities arrested her, the details of the plan quickly unraveled. Prosecutors emphasized the cold, deliberate nature of her actions. For Tara's defense team, the case was an uphill battle. They argued she was mentally unstable, pressured, and not fully in control of her decisions. But the recordings left little room for doubt. Jurors heard her voice, her instructions, and her promises of payment. In January 2016, a jury found Tara Lambert guilty of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. She stood in court in a jail jumpsuit, stripped of the glamour she once displayed, as the verdict was read. A judge had denied her request to appear in civilian clothing and makeup, an image that underscored the gravity of her situation. In February of that year, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. For someone who once projected an image of beauty and poise, the reality of a lengthy prison term was a devastating fall from grace. The legal saga didn't end there. Her conviction was briefly overturned on appeal because of a technical flaw in the indictment. But prosecutors quickly retried her, and in 2017, she was once again found guilty and handed the same 7-year sentence. The justice system left no doubt. Tara had intended to see her husband's ex-wife killed, and her words and actions had gone far beyond idle talk. Public reaction to the case was intense. Major outlets seized on the irony of the story, a fashion model plotting murder in a Walmart parking lot. Headlines across the country called her the model-turned-murder plotter, a label that stuck as her trial played out. The victim, who had narrowly escaped this fate thanks to law enforcement intervention, spoke in court and described Tara as a demon. Those words captured the horror of someone realizing that another person had coldly tried to erase them from existence. The story became a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Behind the carefully maintained image of beauty and charm was a woman who made choices driven by jealousy and malice. For the public, the fascination lay in the juxtaposition. How someone who once walked runways and posed for photographs could sit in a prison cell for trying to orchestrate a killing. Tara Lambert served her sentence in Ohio, her name now less associated with fashion and more permanently linked with crime. Though she was eventually released after completing her term, the story continues to be cited as a chilling example of how envy and resentment can drive people to unthinkable extremes. But Tara's small-town scheme was not the last time the modeling world collided with headlines about crime. Our final case takes us to Brazil, where a glamorous model turned Instagram influencer was exposed for running an international trafficking ring, a scandal that stunned both her country and the global fashion community. Number 10. Kat Torres. For years, Kat Torres cultivated the image of a successful model and social media influencer. Born Catiúcia Torres Soares in Brazil, she entered the modeling world as a teenager, posing for photo shoots in São Paulo before making her way onto international runways. On Instagram, she styled herself as a blonde beauty living a life of luxury. Designer outfits, travel posts, and motivational captions. To her growing online following, Kat was the picture of glamour and empowerment. But in 2024, her carefully curated image came crashing down when Brazilian authorities revealed she was at the center of a shocking human trafficking case. The investigation began after several young women came forward, alleging that Torres had lured them with promises of modeling opportunities abroad. According to prosecutors, those promises were a facade. Instead of fashion shoots, the women found themselves trapped in exploitative arrangements that amounted to forced labor and sex work. Authorities accused Torres of manipulating her victims with false contracts, controlling their movements, and profiting from their exploitation. It was a scandal that rocked Brazil, exposing the dark side of an industry that already had a reputation for preying on the vulnerable. When Torres was arrested in July 2024, the news spread quickly. She was taken into custody in Belo Horizonte, though she had spent much of her career between Rio de Janeiro and international modeling hubs. Police raids uncovered documents and testimony tying her to multiple victims, all of whom described similar stories of coercion and deceit. Brazilian media framed the case as one of the most high-profile trafficking scandals in years, not least because it involved someone with a public persona who had once represented the glamorous face of Brazilian fashion. The trial that followed drew national attention. Prosecutors outlined how Torres leveraged her credibility as a model to recruit women, convincing them she had insider access to agencies and contracts. They emphasized that behind her Instagram photos of beaches and luxury hotels was an operation designed to exploit. Torres, for her part, denied the accusations, insisting she was being targeted unfairly and that the women were lying. But the testimony was overwhelming, and her attempts to paint herself as a victim of misunderstanding fell flat. In late 2024, a Brazilian court delivered its verdict. Kat Torres was convicted of human trafficking and placing women into conditions analogous to slavery. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison, a rare but decisive punishment in a country where such cases often drag on for years. The ruling was hailed by prosecutors as a victory for victims and a signal that even those who hide behind fame and influence could face real consequences. The public reaction was immediate. Social media lit up with commentary, with many of her former followers expressing disbelief that someone they once admired had been exposed as a trafficker. Tabloids in Brazil and abroad ran stories juxtaposing her glamorous modeling shots with her mugshot, a stark reminder of her fall from grace. International outlets picked up the story too, labeling it the case of the model trafficker, and underscoring how influencers can use their platforms to deceive rather than inspire. Today, Kat Torres sits in a Brazilian prison, serving her sentence. Her once vibrant Instagram account is frozen in time, filled with the aspirational posts she used to maintain her image. For the women she exploited, her conviction was a measure of justice. For the public, her story is a striking example of how social media fame can mask darker realities. From centerfolds and runways to reality TV contestants and influencers, these cases show that behind the gloss of modeling lies a spectrum of human stories. Some inspiring, others devastating. In the end, the lives of these women became cautionary tales, reminders that beauty and fame offer no protection from accountability when crime enters the picture.